Hello and welcome to our Week 4 overview lecture. You've had a prodigious amount of lecture material to get through the last couple of weeks, so this week I'm just going to do a very short introduction, and then if you're keen to get more lecture material in, you can either take a look at some of the supplemental lectures for this week or go back and revisit some of the lectures from the last couple of weeks that you may not have had time to finish. Okay, so now we are finally off our foundations theme. We're out of the properly historical material and we're moving into the next theme that we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks, looking at ways of knowing science and its critics. And this particular week of the course I've constructed as a modernist versus postmodernist conceptions of science. The reality is that neither of those terms is very well defined, and the figures that we've got in the two different topics this week, many of them could be slotted actually into either spot. We've used the categorizations to give a chance to talk about and revisit the themes about modernity from the opening weeks of the course, and then to talk a little bit about postmodernism and the fears of postmodernism and fears of relativism and other things that tend to be associated with it. I want to go through a few vocabulary words. This is going to be the only new content I'm going to cover in this lecture, and then I'll talk a little bit about the readings. So the term postmodernism, which is actually strangely an old term, it crops up around the late 19th century, but when you're hearing it today, it's probably in reference to a more recent set of critical social and political theoretical movements that sort of picked up steam from the 60s and 70s critiques into our current period. The term is often applied as an insult. It's often applied to figures who don't think of themselves as postmodernists, who might even be using the term postmodernism to just refer descriptively to a set of stuff. They're not trying to advocate or anything like that. But the broad referent of the term is it's meant to capture positions that are understood to assert that there's been some kind of historical rupture that has undermined old certainties and narratives, or what are sometimes called meta-narratives, particularly around enlightenment, progress, and universality. Now, a lot of the people that we will actually read who are listed under the postmodernist category wouldn't at all think of themselves as postmodernist and might not even be really classified as such. I'm not trying to push the classification on them. But what they do share is they are all people who are looking critically at these narratives of enlightenment, progress, and universality. So our topic this week is to take a look at people who are still trying to explain what the universality of science might mean and why it's happening, and then people who are increasingly critical of that kind of concept and trying to take it apart. I've also included as a handout to go along with this lecture a brief excerpt from a piece by Lyotard that gives you just a couple of pages on postmodernism and postmodernity in contrast to modernity, so you might want to take a quick look at that. The other words that are going to pop up a lot in most of what we're reading this week are these two sort of fairly big words that capture concepts that aren't all that complicated, so I thought I would break those down. The first is ontology. Your ontology is your set of claims about what exists, what really exists out there in the world. Ontology is the study of what exists, and so people might make an ontological claim like there is gender domination. Okay, so it's a claim about something out there in the world. It might not be something tangible, but it is a claim that something exists. And then your epistemology is the way that you understand that you are able to know about things that exist. So how can you justify your capacity to be able to see something and know that it exists? And a lot of the pieces that we're going to be taking a look at in the second topic are going to be making arguments about epistemology, about the epistemology of the natural sciences, and about the need for some other kind of epistemology. So our first topic, as I said, we've loosely called it modernist conceptions of science. The reality is that some of the authors under this topic could have just as easily have been placed in the second topic this week. And you'll also be struck by there's a critical edge in a lot of the folks who fall in this category as well. It's just a slightly different kind of critique than the one being made by the folks in the second topic. So we've got Weber, whom we met as a theorist of capitalism last week. Here he's back with a nice piece talking about science and what it means to want to become a scientist. It's sort of addressed to his contemporary equivalent of sort of postgraduate students thinking about going on for further study. And along the way, talking about what it's like to be an academic in his time and place, he analyzes science in terms of a process of disenchantment, where we become better and better and better at working out good means of achieving the technical and social ends that we've got for ourselves. And this process of disenchantment for Weber, this process of debunking myths and coming into this enlightened space, has the ironic side effect that it undermines meaning. And so it leaves the desire for truth, the desire to do science, as just one irrational goal among many possible irrational goals that's available to people in a modern society that they can pursue if they want to. Take a look at that. It's a classic statement. Then we've got Popper. Popper is probably, of the authors in this section, the one that you're probably the most familiar with, in the sense that a lot of people know his arguments without necessarily having ever read him, or without necessarily knowing his name. He makes an argument that science can be distinguished from pseudoscience by means of the criteria of falsifiability. He talks about the demarcation problem. How do you demarcate science from pseudoscience? And he says, well, scientific theories are capable of being falsified. And then he visualizes science as this huge competitive process where people put forward ideas. Even stupid ideas are fine, but they put them forward into a kind of battle of wits and wills, and other people try to falsify them. And the least falsifiable theories stand the pressure of time. Merton is a classic theorist of science. He's quite prominent in the field. And what he's doing in this piece is he's exploring what he takes to be core values underlying scientific production, and analyzing how those values might be supported or hindered by particular political structures. And he's writing at a point he's concerned with fascism, he's concerned with the Soviet Union, and he's concerned with the direction of politics in the West as well. Okay, so looking at how science fits in and how it doesn't in the political and economic systems that it's situated in. Then we have Michael Polanyi. It's quite an interesting work, this. He's interested in understanding the nature of scientific authority, understood as a distributed network that gathers opinions together and comes up with a concept of authority without any clearly centralized group that's defining what that authority is. One of the interesting things about Polanyi is that this distributed network model for how scientific authority is constituted is actually not hugely far away from what some of the critics are asking for when they're asking for openness to alternative forms of knowledge. The difference is where they draw the line over whose opinion gets included in the network, and for Polanyi there is a very clear need to have done an apprenticeship to be an expert, to enter into that network. There are people pushing at the boundaries of that in the other topic. And then Kuhn is someone who, again, could have been under either of the topics this week. He has a very famous theory about scientific revolutions, and we're taking a look here at a chapter on what he calls normal science, which is sort of the science we're most familiar with, probably intuitively, the science that goes on within an established set of consensus ideas about what's important to research. And it just introduces to his vocabulary about normal science and revolutionary science and the concept of a paradigm, which is a sort of a set of common assumptions that researchers are going to have that's going to make them able to direct their energies in particular ways and exclude certain pieces of information and focus on the ones that are more important for their research program. Kuhn is someone who is often criticized for opening up a lot of critical study of the sciences. Kuhn doesn't himself think that his work opens that up, and so it's something that you can pursue if you're interested in a paper on this kind of topic, is debates over what he does and doesn't open up with his work. And then in topic 2, we've got the folks who are grouped under postmodernist conceptions of science. Some of these people are definitively not really postmodernists, and some of them are probably fairly comfortable being called by that term. But what they share is they are all doing critiques of the self-understanding of the sciences as they take it to be, and proposing everything from radical institutional overthrow through to sort of reform and greater self-awareness and things of that sort. But they tend to be contesting the claims to universality in particular, and the claims to objectivity. So we have Mary Midgley, who is providing an analysis of myths. She calls them myths that underpin contemporary science. Hers is a very short text. It's very readable. As with most of the texts this week, although I have recorded podcasts to support them, the ones in this category you often will be able to read on your own without the podcasts. The podcast will provide some support if you are struggling, and they also provide a bit of broader context if you're interested in the implications of the arguments or how they're situated. The readings under topic 1 are probably more difficult. You may need to go to the podcast for those. For topic 2, many of these readings are fairly straightforward. Okay? Bloor is a foundational text for something called the Strong Program in the Sociology of Science, which is a program that decides to direct anthropological tools away from so-called primitive societies and toward our most modern of institutions, science and technology. And the Strong Program is something that inspires then successive waves of critical studies of science and technology. Bourdieu is one of the more difficult texts in this particular topic. He's also a useful theorist to read in that you'll probably run into him in other classes, writing on other subjects. The sorts of analysis that he's applying here to the sciences, he applies to all sorts of other areas of behavior. And so he's someone that, even though it's a somewhat difficult text, you might want to come to terms with, because you'll be running into him again. He provides a critique of the interests that underlie and drive forms of science that present themselves as though they are disinterested. He says they're unique forms of interest around reputational prestige that are driving competitive behavior in the sciences. Then we have Feyerabend. This is an interesting text. It's an anarchist argument. It's probably the most anti-science in its own way of the pieces that we have available to us here. And he's arguing that science should lose its privileged position, that it started off as something revolutionary and critical and breaking down traditional systems of knowledge. It's no longer serving that function. It's become dominant and dogmatic, and he wants it to be torn down in ways that it just becomes one among many forms of thought, and he's happy to have all sorts of irrational forms of thought or false forms of thought take their place alongside, because he thinks what's most damaging is having the one dominant form of thought. This is the kind of text that if people think there's something wrong with the critique of science, this text will confirm everything that they're terrified about. And yet working out where Feyerabend is playing and where he's serious is an interesting task in reading the text as well. Then we have Collins. It's one of our examples this week of something called standpoint theory. It's a critique of what she calls positivism and a proposal for an alternative epistemological position, so an alternative position about how we can know what we know, how we know our knowledge is valid, from the standpoint of black feminism in the US. Watson, Varon, and Turnbull is a bit more local. The bulk of this article is an extended case study of an Australian indigenous knowledge system and its implications for Western science and the interactions between the two. It starts off, though, with a very broad, very quick historical survey of several different historical societies, the Incas, the Anasazi, and again looking at the issue of how knowledge systems are organized outside of the domination of Western science. We have the Rose, who's making a feminist argument that transcending the sexual division of labor will make it possible to overcome an antagonistic relation to nature. And this article is thematizing some of the things that drive a lot of the critiques of the sciences, fears that the technology itself is driving us toward danger, toward extermination, and she's worried particularly about the threat of a nuclear annihilation at the point that she's writing. And then we have Harding, who's problematizing categories of both gender and science in order to ask about the challenges facing the construction of a critical feminist analysis of science. So a lot of feminist material, some critical race studies material, and then a range of other kinds of critiques of modern science. And we can play these off against the conceptions of science in the first topic.